Dear Professor Lawrence, dear Professor Töpfer, such an intellectual misuse of welcoming remarks is the most stimulating. So thank you very much for misusing the time, and thank you very much for giving us food for thought. Talking about the location, you mentioned that the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies is located in Potsdam. Well, we are meeting at Potsdamer Platz, and so it's probably the right location in Berlin. If there is any place in Berlin to meet, then it's at Potsdamer Platz. And historically, this was a vibrant place in the first half of, or the first third of the 20th century. And this was the place where the first traffic light in Germany stood, here on Potsdamer Platz. And Mark Lawrence spoke about governance, maybe even regulation. And I will come back to the topic of regulation at a later point in time. But being here at Potsdamer Platz is probably also the right place to talk about regulation. But I'm very grateful and thankful for this conference. And I'm also very grateful for the title of this conference, Critical Global Discussions, because this title highlights what the discussion of climate engineering is all about. Well, first of all, it is about becoming involved in discussions whose outcome we cannot yet predict. And these discussions must be global, because after all, we are trying to address the global challenge of global warming, and we try to address it amongst others by means of climate engineering. And a global perspective is also needed because the impact of climate engineering measures have to be assessed. And the dialogue and the assessment has to be critical in a rather philosophical sense. Assessing climate engineering by using binding criteria should be one of the objectives. And the criteria have not yet been defined. And the proposals that have been made for climate engineering still give rise to numerous questions. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by referring to the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, because this report makes clear that the international community does not have that much time left to take action to reduce emissions quickly and to limit global warming to a maximum of 2 degrees. If efforts fail, so-called, as it is said in the report, negative emissions will be the only way to achieve the objective of limiting climate warming to 2 degrees. And this term negative emissions implies using climate engineering technologies which involve opportunities, but at the same time which involve risks. And we have not yet found the measures to assess effectiveness, to describe the consequences in a reliable way. The current climate debate is focusing in particular on massive afforestation as one means to intervene, and on bioenergy and bioenergy power plants with carbon capture and storage. BECS is the acronym for this. However, should the international climate negotiations not produce the desired success, there will certainly be a call for other climate engineering technologies. Klaus Töpfer quoted Paul Crutzen and his alternatives: change behavior or use technologies. What is the objective of the German government? Our primary objective is that we have to work on the behavior side, that we have to try to limit global warming, that we have to focus on adaptation measures in order to deal with it. And this is where we are concentrating all our efforts. For that reason, we are concerned if other countries choose other options, like, for example, abolish a carbon tax, which is, by many economists' standards, one of the most effective means of climate protection. If you abolish a carbon tax, you move into different ways, just as other countries do. But we believe at the same time that we cannot ignore the the technological development and the political development. There has to be a plan B besides this plan A of the German government. And this is why we, as a ministry, as the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, this is why we have been following the debate for quite some time, and this is why we want to get involved. In 2011, we had a report published and financed by our ministry titled Large-Scale Intentional Interventions into the Climate System. This report, this scoping report, covers the full range of the topic. It provides orientation and impetus for the international debate, and it has been debated in academic circles in Germany and beyond. There is a program by the German National Science Foundation, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. They have a priority program now looking into the issue, and we are grateful that the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam looks to it as well, and we are grateful for this conference, Mark. Thank you very much for this. If we talk about assessment, what does assessment mean? Assessment means that we have not yet found an ideal solution to the question how to deal with climate changes, and we have not found ideal technologies how to manipulate the climate. There is no ecologically sound, no socially and politically compatible and economically justifiable way to intervene into the climate. And I would like to, in the coming minutes, provide you with an overview of 3 challenges. You may even call it dilemma in terms of climate engineering. Klaus Töpfer mentioned the term ethics. My first dilemma, my first challenge is an ethical one, an ethical challenge or dilemma. It is obvious that climate engineering by no means constitutes a solution from today's viewpoint. But as I said, a sober review of the progress of climate policy reveals that we need to consider this option carefully at an early stage. But how far may or how far must research go? Does climate engineering research encourage a repair policy which only entails ever new unaccountable risks? After all, none of the proposed technologies is ready for application or has been tested in practice. Some were tried to be, even we as a ministry try to organize a first test, and I will come back to that later when I talk about ocean fertilization. But it may even prove impossible to test many of these technologies sufficiently. It is also clear that the political focus, as I just said, must be on climate mitigation and adaptation. So our report underpins this view. Could climate engineering research have a biasing, self-reinforcing effect, making alternative pathways in climate policy appear realistic at a too early a stage? And on the other hand, can research simply ignore the plan B for climate protection? Is it a must for research policy to have it critically assessed by the scientific community or to have it even actively developed? Our survey, the one which was published in 2011, produced, to my understanding, a very clear answer to this question. It is imperative that research is being conducted for ethical reasons. However, this initially means research to enable the assessment of climate engineering rather than to prepare its use. The required knowledge base must be available if, all risks considered, climate engineering proves to be the most socially viable or even the sole option to combat climate change. And we must be able to fully assess the consequences of applying the relevant technologies. This means considering whether we need to accept the consequences of climate engineering in order to avoid the even more serious consequences of climate change. And there will certainly be no obvious solutions in this case. Research, and research policy in particular, bear special responsibility in view of the risks involved and the controversial nature of the topic. We must ensure a transparent public debate to justify the research. Klaus Töpfer spoke about a knowledge democracy. A knowledge democracy requires such a public debate. It cannot be conducted in scientific circles alone. And research, in turn, must provide a solid knowledge base in different areas. It is important to consider, for example, the possible effects of large-scale cultivation of plants for bioenergy generation from a scientific and ecological and economic perspective. Each summer in German media there is a topic which is being played by journalists at a time where there is no hard news in other fields. Last year it was about the increasing change of the German landscape by maize, corn production in Germany, because this was a topic to critically describe and discuss the use of bioenergy at the cost of biodiversity, at the cost of food production and food security worldwide. So we have to assess these effects. And this raises highly complex issues of governance. Mark, you spoke about governance, and political management, which can often only be solved through international cooperation. And this leads me to the basic principles of ethics and international law, and to a second dilemma, a political dilemma. The use of climate engineering technologies needs to be controlled because these technologies involve incalculable risk or unknown risks, and it involves cross-border effects. Such control can only be achieved through international cooperation. And now I'm close to the term regulation at Potsdamer Platz. Mark used the term governance. And the same goes for research related to climate engineering, which must equally be subject to international regulation. This may come as a surprise from the perspective of a research ministry that tries to speak for and tries to enable research under the general guidance of freedom of research. Well, let me focus a little bit on the challenge. The aim is not to limit research on climate engineering, but rather to enable legitimate research to be performed. There is much to suggest that decisions on possible applications of any climate engineering measure and on related research must be taken in the context of relevant international conventions. Well, what are the relevant international frameworks for climate engineering? Is it the Convention on Biological Diversity, which bans climate engineering activities and only allows research under specific conditions? Or would it be the Framework Convention on Climate Change? At this moment in time, it is hard to imagine an intensive debate to ensure the required level of intergovernmental cooperation under the UNFCCC. Anyone supporting this goal would immediately be suspected of diverting attention from the purpose of an effective climate protection agreement and on giving the wrong signals. Climate policy's careful approach to the topic of climate engineering must therefore be not be misunderstood as political inactivity. Not regulating and not debating an issue in a given context can in fact be based on a particular political stance. What do I mean? As regards research as such, there are already provisions governing individual fields of research related to climate engineering. The most important example is research on ocean fertilization, and this is being regulated under the London Convention and Protocol. Many years back, we as a ministry financed an ocean fertilization test. It was scandalized in the German media, and the test at the same time failed because the wind was too strong, the currents went the wrong way, and the whole experiment was unsuccessful. Well, the London Protocol and the London Convention could serve as a model for research policy. It provides for freedom of research while at the same time defining limits and requiring special justification for research related to climate engineering. And such regulation can provide research with a reliable framework, but it cannot serve as a blueprint for the broad use of climate engineering as an instrument of climate policy for today. The German government takes the view that a broad regulatory debate to include the use of climate engineering in whatever convention, particularly the Framework Convention on Climate Change, would currently be the wrong signal at this point in time. Our main goal must be to achieve an ambitious, comprehensive and binding agreement on climate protection. But on the other hand, we do need fair arrangements for and mechanisms to work on climate engineering at the same time. We cannot ignore the fact that specific considerations regarding, for example, the role of BECCS are being introduced in climate policy following the publication of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. And we have to ask the tough question. The political question is obvious. Would it not be wise to choose a proactive approach and establish comprehensive international rules for research on and the use of climate engineering at an early stage before individual states make uncoordinated efforts in this regard, or before the international community comes under pressure to take immediate action? We must admit, also as a government, we have not yet found a solution to this dilemma. The federal government gives, as I said, and I'm repeating it over and over again, primacy to climate protection and adaptation, but we are observing also a precautionary principle which will be open to a constructive debate about guardrails for climate engineering when the time comes. And last but not least, my third description of a third dilemma is a scientific dilemma. The large-scale use of climate engineering technologies is not an option at present because these technologies involve quite a number of challenges and risk and cross-border effects, as I just said. However, an assessment of the impact of climate engineering technologies requires also experiments which are hard to be conducted under near application conditions. But Mark, you said at the very beginning, differentiation is necessary. And here I try to start to differentiate. For example, bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage differ fundamentally from, for example, solar radiation management, manipulating the radiation budget by using aerosol particles, for example. But the impact on both technologies has to be assessed in different ways. This leads to the question, how can we develop sound expertise for this type of differentiated assessment? And how can we make it a basis for political decision-making when the required research involves, for example, illicit and undesired use of climate engineering technologies in the first place? We still have no master plan for further action. Climate engineering is confronting us with completely new issues owing to its far-reaching consequences. Therefore, we need an approach which ensures that social assessment and political regulations can keep pace with the increase in scientific knowledge and develop side by side. Time for deliberation, time for understanding, as Klaus Töpfer reminded us, and time for public and open debate. An open social and research policy debate, also including a debate about field experiments, must therefore differentiate, as Mark said, and must avoid generalization. There is certainly a difference between the assessment of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and insertion of aerosols in the atmosphere, for example. Why so? Because all these technologies involve completely different risks. They involve completely different cross-border effects. Secondly, those technologies are gaining significance, which the current debate considers to be of prior regulatory importance in the context of the IPCC. And third, technologies are, for example, CDR technologies, are generally closer to climate protection and to the climate protection debate than, for example, solar radiation management. Now, what criteria could guide future research on climate engineering? One, research should in particular serve the clear and comprehensive assessment of risks. This means giving consideration not only to scientific and economic aspects, but also to acceptance, equity, governance, and ethical justification. And the same holds true also for opportunities of these technologies, for sure. Secondly, research should focus on technologies which involve specific risks or require specific regulation in a given political context. Issues addressed in UN conventions or discussed by other international bodies must be at the top of the agenda. And certainly, and this is my third point here, there will be measures with a favorable balance between feasibility, expected benefits on the one hand, and potential risks on the other hand. And these measures could provide genuine solutions. Examples include large-scale afforestation or the use of carbon dioxide in the synthesis of industrial products or fuels. Research should also be aware of shifting baselines. Changes may occur in the way specific technological options are being perceived. The context of political and social assessment may change, and new research always refers to what may be possible or feasible in the future. It helps if researchers and research stakeholders work hand in hand to place trends in a political and social context and enable policymakers to form their own option. Mark, you spoke about the thirst for interdisciplinary dialogue. When we published this assessment report in 2011 on climate engineering, a lot of academic communities worked together. Climate researchers, legal scholars, economists, philosophers, political scientists, risk researchers. And it was a learning experience for all, learning to understand the languages of the other field and to start to develop a common language. And the challenge is even bigger if we talk about transdisciplinary research, because that entails that researchers have to make themselves understandable to a larger public and to bring across the need for differentiation, the avoidance of early generalization, and at the same time be understandable. That is a challenge, no easy solution for it. One of the testing grounds for it is for sure the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. Let me conclude by summarizing some points which are characteristic for climate engineering from a research policy viewpoint, at least from a German research policy viewpoint. We as a federal government try to pursue a proactive and responsible policy in the field of climate engineering. Our goal is not to pave the way for the application of these technologies prior to increased efforts to avoid global warming in the first place. But we need a far-sighted debate about climate engineering. We have to look at it in a larger time frame, as Mark said in the very beginning. And we try to play a leading role also internationally by triggering a scientific and political and open public debate about climate engineering. Of course, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research supports the responsible and fair international regulation of research on climate engineering. We want to observe the freedom of research and at the same time provide a reliable and socially justifiable base for research in Germany and worldwide. Our aim must be to create a framework for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research which supports a differentiated debate and which enables precautionary policy. And the decision about the future of climate engineering will ultimately be taken on a political level. So isolated findings produced only in a closed scientific environment will not help. We need the social dialogue, we need the involvement of society at large in this field. And for example, and for this reason, we are grateful also for this conference here, because it provides the basis for such an open political debate. So thank you very much for coming here. Thank you for devoting your time to the issue, and I look forward to the results of this conference. Thank you very much.